Chapter 8. The journey to the hospital was uncomfortable, and Jennifer especially missed the modern conveniences of running water and mechanical vehicles. She grabbed Victor's hand. He whirled around in surprise, but then smiled with relief as he saw that Jennifer had his hand. "How are you doing?" asked Victor. "I'm so tired," said Jennifer in an exhausted voice. "Thirsty?" asked Victor as he reached for a canteen. She nodded and took the flask from him. She unscrewed the cap and pressed her lips to the opening. The water that came out was not as cool as she would have liked, but her parched mouth and throat found the moisture refreshing. She was careful only to take 3 swallows so as not to use too much water at once. She quickly handed the canteen back to Victor before she could give in to the temptation to drink it all. Victor smiled and took a single swallow before restoring the cap to its place at the top and tucking it back into his pack. Jennifer looked at the others to see if she was the only one that seemed exhausted. Kirana and Jonathan seemed alert as they walked together. Lucas and Row 82 were driving the carriage. Lucas was thrilled, and Row 82 was impossible to read. Of course, he seemed to have shown only 2 emotional states to any of them. He was either emotionless, calculating, and logical, or he was angry. Jennifer decided that he was not angry. Lizard darted around in short bursts, just as an actual lizard might. Jennifer smiled. While the behavior was odd, her memory of being scooped up by the tall yet incredibly fast man when he had saved her from the fate of a slave made her appreciative of his eccentricity. At last her gaze turned to Stephanie. Though none of them were especially clean after going through all the dust in their battle or on the road, she seemed especially unkempt. There were dark circles around her eyes, and her long hair that was typically smooth and straight seemed frizzed and matted. She was hunched over as she walked, as though she had not slept in days. Jennifer regretted that she had felt so unhappy with their journey only moments before. Stephanie felt Jennifer's gaze and whirled back at her like a terrified animal caught in a trap. "Are you okay?" mouthed Jennifer with a concerned look. Stephanie narrowed her eyes as if to determine who was speaking to her. Jennifer raised an eyebrow in confusion. Stephanie spun back around and stared at the ground without acknowledging Jennifer's question. The old sensation of feeling like she was too late came back like a cold wind, piercing through her clothing and flesh and sinking into her bones. "Jennifer?" asked Victor in a concerned voice. Jennifer turned to him. "I really felt like we've been through so much," said Jennifer. "We've done so much. I thought the worst must be behind us." "I hope it is," said Victor. "I get the feeling that things are going to get much, much worse," said Jennifer solemnly as she looked at Stephanie. Her tone startled Victor. He took her hand and followed her eyes to see Stephanie swatting at something that was not there. "We have come back through time so far into the past, and I'm still too late." Victor turned back to Jennifer. "What's going on?" he whispered. "I don't know," she said. "I just don't know." It was not long before Stephanie was surrounded by the others. Victor had insisted that the carriage be stopped so they could try and help her. She had been laid down on a blanket and given a canteen. Victor gripped the Heaven's Breath key, and his eyes began glowing brightly. He took her trembling hand. It was cold and clammy, even in the warm sun. "Symptoms of heat exhaustion," said Lucas in a worried voice. Victor shook his head after a moment and turned to the others. "She's doing fine physically," said Victor. "It's not heat exhaustion. It's something in her mind." "Perhaps I can help," said Jonathan. "Please do," said Victor. Jonathan gripped his key, and a moment later the blue tint of the mind drum fell on his surroundings. To his horror, a familiar creature with a flurry of tentacles surrounding it had wrapped around Stephanie. Jonathan gasped, wondering how he had missed its presence. He grabbed his key, and in an instant it morphed into a huge fiery sword. "William Fine!" shouted Jonathan angrily. The creature twisted toward him in surprise. "What are you?" thundered the monster. "Leave her alone!" shouted Jonathan. The monster roared with laughter. "Or else what?" chided the monster. Jonathan rushed toward it and slashed off a tentacle. The creature shrieked and recoiled. "You must be an ally of this one," reasoned the creature as it positioned itself defensively against Jonathan. "Strange that the demon prophetess did not warn about you." "I'm warning you now," shouted Jonathan. He hoped that the creature might withdraw from Stephanie without forcing his hand, as he remembered the worries that Lucas had conveyed about accidentally being thrown to their own time if they significantly modified any aspect of the timeline. Unfortunately, the monster seemed to be confident. "Your active presence in the mind realm makes you physically vulnerable," said the monster. If the creature had been capable of smiling, Jonathan perceived it would have been. The confidence of his opponent worried him. "You have little power in the physical realm, Fine," said Jonathan. "True enough," said the monster, "but I have allies in the physical realm, and they are more than a match for you, especially since you will not be able to see them coming without this one." In the physical realm, Kirana had laid Jonathan down next to Stephanie as comfortably as she could. She hated being unable to do anything to help him, but she said nothing. "He'll be okay, Kirana," said Victor. Kirana shot an angry glare at Victor. She did not appreciate his patronizing commentary. Victor looked away uncomfortably. "We've got company," shouted Row 82. Kirana looked around. Sig pulled Chloe behind him to protect her. The women in the carriage got down in their seats. "What is it?" asked Lucas as he searched the horizon. "Fire demons," said Row 82. He had no sooner said the words than a huge fireball landed on the ground behind the carriage. The horses leapt with fright, and the women, with the exception of Kirana, screamed in fear. Lucas desperately gripped the reins to slow them, but the best he was able to do was direct them in a wide turn. "Lizard," shouted Sig. "I'm on it," said Lizard as he teleported away. The sound of screaming acolytes far away brought a smile to Kirana's face. She pulled out her key, and it expanded into a large sword as her eyes began glowing. "Sig, we've got heavy fire incoming," shouted Row 82. Sig's eyes glowed brightly, and a golden shield appeared above the entire area. The rain of fire landed on the shield harmlessly. Jonathan continued to fight in the mind realm, much to his opponent's annoyance. "It's only a matter of time before we prevail," said the monster as it flung a series of tentacles at him from various angles. Though Jonathan slashed through most of them, one of them slapped him backwards, and he crashed into the earth. "Your struggle is pointless," chided the creature. Jonathan got to his feet only to get slapped backwards again. He ignored the pain in his joints and crawled to his feet, but the creature was determined to keep him off balance and slapped him back again. Jonathan landed hard on the ground, but this time he swung his sword around instead of trying to get up and was able to slice off a tentacle. The creature shrieked in pain and recoiled just long enough for Jonathan to get to his feet. He looked back at Stephanie and hoped that she was having a chance to recover. In the literal realm, Lucas had managed to get the carriage under control, and Victor had loaded Jonathan and Stephanie in with the maids from Chloe's home as the others fought back. Chloe shouted to Lucas to get his attention. "Let's punch a hole and see if we can get them to safety," suggested Chloe. Lucas nodded as he had come to the same conclusion. If the others could get away, the Heavenly Sword and Heavenly Shield could handle the rest of these fire demon worshippers. The massive creature threw its tentacles onto the ground of the mind realm and then leapt toward Jonathan. Jonathan raced out of its path and narrowly missed being crushed by its hulking body. He got up and swung his sword in a flurry of attacks, but the creature swiped low enough to take Jonathan's feet out from under him and then slapped him backwards again. Jonathan knew he needed help. The battle was not going as smoothly as he had hoped. "Sam!" he shouted as he searched the skies. He could find no sign of his feathered companion, but slowly he became aware of a noise in the distance. The creature with whom Jonathan had been fighting also seemed to hear it, and turned to see what the incessant tapping sound that grew louder might reveal from the hills on the blue horizon. Jonathan's eyes grew wide as he saw a man carrying a large flaming broadsword riding on the back of a large white horse. He looked quite impressive. "Samuel Godwinson!" shouted the creature. "William Fine!" shouted the rider. He had long gray hair, or at least long for a man. It seemed to bounce as his horse galloped across the blue earth. His eyes glowed white. He had a strong jawline and broad shoulders. Unlike Jonathan, who relied on finesse and technique more than power, this man resembled Sig as he boldly charged toward the creature. Jonathan watched in awe as he rode up to it and sliced through a swarm of tentacles as if they were made of paper. After turning around and slashing through another swarm of tentacles, the creature disappeared in a large cloud of thick black smoke. "Samuel Godwinson?" asked Jonathan. "You can see me?" asked the rider. Jonathan nodded as his sword turned back into a mirrored key. Samuel's eyes grew wide. "Where did you get that?" he said apprehensively. "From 1,000 years in the future. I came back with Jennifer Cedar," said Jonathan, hoping that would be the best explanation. Samuel seemed to relax. His sword turned back into a mirrored key, and he hopped off of his horse. "Thank you, my friend," whispered Samuel to his horse. It whinnied in response and galloped away before Samuel turned back to Jonathan. "You have me at a disadvantage, sole key-bearer of the future," said Samuel. "Right," said Jonathan. "My name is Jonathan Knight." "And who is the woman that you were defending?" asked Samuel as he looked at Stephanie lying on the ground. Her dark hair and skin seemed to glow in the ambient blue light of the mind realm, and Jonathan could tell immediately that Samuel appreciated her beauty. It made him glad, since she had suffered so much. Jonathan pondered whether or not he should play a matchmaker. "Stephanie Mason is her name," said Jonathan. "She came with me and several other key-bearers." "What key does she bear?" asked Samuel. "The key of prophecy," answered Jonathan. "Has she met Miss Baldwin?" asked Samuel. "She has the key of prophecy in our time." "She has," said Jonathan, "but Miss Baldwin seems most concerned with going to the hospital of Ethan McCarthy. We are heading there now." "Very good," said Samuel excitedly. "I am already at the hospital in the physical realm. I look forward to meeting you in person, Mr. Knight." Samuel shook Jonathan's hand and vanished out of sight. Jonathan looked back at Stephanie, who finally seemed peaceful, and then disappeared himself. As Jonathan came to, the maids in the carriage helped him up. "How are we doing?" asked Jonathan. Stephanie tapped Jonathan on his shoulder and pointed at her forehead. "Better," said Stephanie in her mind. She smiled softly. Already she appeared healthier. Her eyes no longer looked as sunken, and even her black hair had seemed to shine again. "Thank you for helping me." Jonathan remembered Samuel. "Actually, we both had help," said Jonathan aloud. The women looked at the two of them in confusion, but they continued their conversation. "Who?" asked Stephanie. "Samuel Godwinson," said Jonathan. "An impressive man. He came rushing to save us on one of these animals pulling the carriage." "A horse?" asked one of the maids. "Yes, that's it," said Jonathan with a smile. "A horse." Jonathan's inability to remember what a horse was disguised his effort to suggest how impressive Samuel Godwinson was, but Jonathan hoped it would be enough. "So who came to attack us in the physical realm?" asked Jonathan to the maids. "The physical realm?" asked one of the maids. He realized that the mind realm was as foreign a concept to them as the presence of horses were to him. "Who attacked us?" he clarified. "David Sawyer's fire demon worshippers," said one of the maids. His eyes grew wide as he thought of how fire demon worshippers had been responsible for the death of Kirana's family. He suddenly sat up and tried to look out the window. "Is everyone still here?" he asked. "Is my wife still safe?" "The angry woman with the fire sword cut the earth beneath them, and they tumbled into a pit," said another of the maids. Jonathan breathed a sigh of relief. "Okay," he said. Stephanie smiled at the description, "angry woman with the fire sword," and would have said something about how accurate that description was if she had been able. Before long, the carriage slowed down and came to a halt. Jonathan gripped his key and searched with his mind. He recognized Samuel Godwinson approaching on horseback and smiled. "Stephanie," said Jonathan, "let's get out." He opened the door of the carriage and helped Stephanie down. "Feeling better?" called Lucas to her as she dusted herself off. She smiled and nodded, but as she turned, she suddenly caught a glimpse of Samuel Godwinson riding his horse out to meet them. A vision flashed before her mind of him looking into her eyes and holding her close. Her heart raced as she looked at him. Her breath grew shallow. Suddenly she blinked her eyes and the vision closed. He had already approached and was getting off of his horse. She quickly turned away from him. She did not want to develop feelings for a handsome stranger as she had with Jonathan. The pain of his rejection welled up in her memory. "Samuel Godwinson," said Jonathan with a wide smile. Samuel smiled back and shook his hand. Stephanie feigned disinterest as Jonathan turned to Stephanie. "Now that we are meeting in person, let me introduce you to Stephanie Mason," he said with a smile. Suddenly, Stephanie realized that Jonathan was smiling a bit wider than he typically did. Her expression turned to one of anger as she understood that he was trying to set her up. Samuel did not seem to notice, and he took her hand gently in his. "Very nice to meet you, Miss Mason," he said. His voice was clear and smooth, and Stephanie had to fight to calm her racing heart. "She, said Jonathan. Samuel looked her in the eye. She forced herself to look away. "She's mute. She does not speak." Stephanie looked to see how he would react to her disability. "Forgive me, Miss Mason," said Samuel. It took a moment for Stephanie to realize that he was doing the same thing that Jonathan could do. He was not speaking vocally, but speaking through her mind. You have the soul key?" asked Stephanie in her mind. "I do," said Samuel. Something inside her softened as she listened to his voice in her mind. She was weary of writing. She was weary of pointing. She wanted to shout. Of course, Jonathan could have listened to her, but he was married to Kirana now, and it felt inappropriate to be sharing thoughts with him. It felt particularly inappropriate since she had been in love with him. The bright green eyes of the man before her seemed so welcoming and inviting. She found him incredibly attractive. She turned away long enough to see the maids whispering to one another as they saw him, and she took a deep breath. Her desire to speak freely to someone won out over her stubbornness to avoid speaking to this man. "Jonathan says that you saved me," said Stephanie. "Jonathan?" asked Samuel. "I'm sorry, are you and he—" "No," said Stephanie. "He is married to Kirana, our heaven's sword-bearer. We just tend to call people by their first names in our time." "Would you prefer I call you Stephanie, then?" asked Samuel, unsure of himself. Stephanie smiled. He smiled back. "Yes, I would," she said at last. "And if you prefer, feel free to call me Samuel," said Samuel with a genuine smile. "Thank you, Samuel. I will," she said. She ignored Jonathan's grin and focused on Samuel. "Dr. McCarthy has an impressive facility," said Samuel as he turned and pointed to a large tower on the horizon. "I would be delighted if you would allow me to show it to you, Stephanie." He offered his arm to her. "I would be delighted to see it," said Stephanie as she took it. Jonathan gave her a smile as he watched them walk toward the hospital together. Stephanie shook her head, but decided there was no harm in enjoying the company of a handsome man that was able to listen to her. Samuel Godwinson felt elation with every step he took as he guided her toward the stone tower that housed patients and research. He could tell just by seeing her that she understood loss. Of course, she was not unique in these feelings, and he had helped dozens of people that had experienced similar feelings, especially since he had acquired the soul key. Even before that, he had a certain empathy, as his own wife and baby had been murdered by Sarah Hawkins before he had met Jennifer Cedar and received a divine key. Certainly he was no stranger to the attention of beautiful women either, but he had never felt a desire to be in a relationship again for fear that his involvement with the divine keys would bring any prospective mate into danger. He had secretly had a crush on Alexis Taylor, since she was also a divine keybearer and was also quite beautiful. She had given him the impression that she was also interested in him, but she would express boredom with his compulsive habit to listen to and help those that were struggling with emotional pain. After Molly Patterson had gone mad, and when he had decided to join Dr. McCarthy as a psychologist, she had decided to travel the world. He knew that it was uncharacteristic for him to be as bold as he had been with Stephanie, but there was something inside of him that was compelled to be close to her the moment he saw her in the mind realm. While it was true that Stephanie was beautiful with her dark skin, black hair, and brown eyes, it was not her beauty that had moved him. There was something intangible about her that had caught his interest. He hoped that, in time, she might grow to feel the same about him. Of course, the two of them were spending so much time thinking about the other that they were completely unprepared when the demon worshippers came.